Okay, good afternoon or almost good evening, everyone. My name's Nikki Hitchcock, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the first keynote of the conference. Before I do that, though, I want to say a few words about Dorothy Blair, in whose memory this keynote lecture is given. Dorothy Blair, who died on the 12th of November 1998, was a distinguished scholar and translator of African literature in French. She was also a founding committee member and honorary vice president of the Association for the Study of Caribbean African Literature in French, ASCAL, which later became, of course, SFPS. And you'll be hearing more about that after this lecture. I personally have strong memories of Dorothy, then in her 70s, attending the early meetings of ASCAL in the South Cloisters at UCL with a number of the people in this room. And I'm sure that the other founding members present here will acknowledge Dorothy's extraordinary passion and enthusiasm. It was Dorothy who designed the original ASCAL logo that is still the logo of SFPS today. Born in 1913, Dorothy initially trained as a school teacher of French. When she married a colonial civil servant, Maurice Blair, in 1939, Dorothy emigrated to South Africa, where she became lecturer in French at the University of Cape Town and then professor of Romance languages at Wits. She left South Africa in 1977 for the UK, when she and Maurice retired to Brighton. Dorothy Blair was very much a pioneer. She was invited by Léopold Sédar Senghor to attend the first ever Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres in Dakar in 1966. She also gave a paper at the inaugural meeting of the ALA, the African Literature Association, in Austin, Texas in 1975. The following year, in 1976, Dorothy published her pioneering study, African Literature in French, with Cambridge University Press. It was a must-read for all of us who started working on Francophone African literature in the 1980s. Dorothy Blair's work as a scholar has been hugely influential on Francophone Postcolonial Studies. She was also a distinguished translator of Francophone fiction, publishing some 20 translations from French into English, including works by what were then little-known writers such as Mariam Abba and Assia Djeba to the English-speaking world. For this year's Dorothy Blair Memorial Lecture, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Jennifer Lee from the University of Oxford. We've been trying to get her to come and give a keynote for quite a few years now, so it's particularly delightful that she's here today. Jenny, is Professor of Literature in French at Oxford and Fellow of Christchurch. She completed her undergraduate studies in Sydney and her postgraduate studies in Paris. Her main research and teaching fields are literature in French from 1721 to the present, with particular interests in colonialism, postcolonialism, Orientalism, exoticism, métissage, material objects, and the relationship between writing and the visual. And Jenny has published extensively in all these areas. During the COVID pandemic, Jenny came up with what she described on social media as the maddest, but also tastiest research project of her career, when she worked with the Oxford Cake Shop to create a real-life, or as Jenny put it, real cake, three-dimensional edible version of Madame Bovary's wedding cake. So like Dorothy Blair, Jenny is also an artist who drew the design for the cake based on Flaubert's description in the novel. And if you're familiar with the description, you'll appreciate quite what a challenge this must have been. Jenny's most recent monograph, The Colonial Comedy, Imperialism in the French Realist Novel, was published with OUP in 2016. The book was described by our current president, Maeve McCusker, in French Studies as an important study that recovers neglected novels and offers compelling and original readings of familiar ones. This book, Maeve says, should be required reading for both 19e-ists and postcolonialists. Jenny also co-edited the 2022 volume in our Francophone Postcolonial Studies series, French Decadence in a Global Context, Colonialism and Exoticism, published by Liverpool University Press. Today, Jenny will share with us her thoughts on the endings of empire, reading for the colonial plot. So please join me in a warm welcome for Professor Jennifer Lee. So thank you so much for that introduction, Nikki, and thank you to SFPS and Maeve, who's not here unfortunately, for inviting me. I'm actually really moved to be here because a long, long time ago in the last century, the first ever academic conference I went to when I was a PhD student in France was the ASCALP conference. And as you will be learning soon, those of you who are new, ASCALP was the precursor to SFPS. And I was amazed at how warm and friendly and welcoming the conference was for a completely unknown diesel student from a different country. And I'm going to say that Peter Wilkins was one of the people who was so extremely warm and welcoming and he's here today. I must say it was very bad preparation for my second conference, which was held in France, which was not quite right. So, moving on rapidly. So I've come up with a very literal interpretation of the conference theme, as in the case of Rwanda wedding cake. I can be very literal-minded at times. So I'm going to look at the plot of a selection of novels from France's high colonial era and look at them in the light of their endings and ask what they can tell us about the relationship between literature and French imperial project. So you might ask yourself, you might be asking why? Why would you ask that plot in relation to colonialism? So my methodological approach when I'm not creating cakes is usually about the meeting between form and politics in some way or another, and often narratology and postcoloniality. But in the past, I've mostly focused on elements other than plot, and the book of the thesis, a long time ago, Cliché de la femme exotique. So I did work on colonial literature then, but I was looking at it through the lens of the type. And the type is a term taken from scientific literature, but also colonial postcards of the golden era of the early 1900s. And types is the opposite of plot patterns. You're looking at theme rather than event, and description rather than narration. So what I want to do now is think about colonial plot. And I'm thinking about it, first of all, in light of the argument made by Frederick Jameson way back in 1986 in his notorious article, Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism. So Jameson argued that third world texts, even those which are seemingly private and invested with a properly individual dynamic, necessarily project a political dimension in the form of national allegory. The story of the private individual destiny is always an allegory of the embattled situation of the public third world culture and society. So I'm not going to start discussing the use of the term third world. There's been a lot of critical ilk spilt about this, and I'm not even really going to engage directly with these arguments. There's been a lot of famous engagement with them, notably by Ejaz Ahmad in a complete attack, and then more positively, some recent studies a little bit more positive by critics such as Julie McGonigal and Yogita Goyal. I want to pause on the notion that in some texts, the story of the private individual destiny is a form of national allegory. So I think this approach is actually much more useful in the case of colonial literature. So I'm going to work with the hypothesis that in the colonial era, texts by Europeans set in the European colonies always, I'm always hesitant about that, but always, let's say, have an allegorical dimension behind what seems like a private and libidinal dynamic. In other words, the individual stories and romance plots are various forms and degrees of allegory for the colonizer-colonized relationship. So Abdul Arjan Mohammed calls this Manichaean allegory, but I'll come back to him because I want to argue against the term Manichaean because it has, I think, too binary an opposition of good and evil. So allegory is still there. So allegory is this key term. It's a useful term, but we need to have a caveat, an important caveat. So the native woman in most of these narratives, and in most of these cases it is a woman, is not given the grandeur that you normally associate with a traditional allegorical embodiment. So in this case, the allegory works via synecdoche, the reminder that synecdoche is the part standing for the whole, and it's a sort of devalued form of allegory. So in a normal allegory, you have a physical embodiment of an abstract concept. And in this version, you've got an individual woman, so a physical embodiment, who represents her race, the part standing for the whole, the synecdoche, rather than an abstract concept. And I just want to be clear that I'm discussing race as an interlinking set of cultural constructs, rather than anything real. In parallel with Jameson's term national allegory, I'm not going to be using the term colonial allegory, which might seem more obvious, but rather racial allegory. And my reasons for this, the two real reasons. One is that in many of these novels, plot becomes a means of playing out notions of racial conflict and racial destiny, a failed encounter between the races. And these notions underlie colonial discourse. And I think also that the term racial allegory is more useful in that it invites applications to broader contexts, including narratives about the immigrant experience and concerns that dominate our own era. So in looking at plot as racial allegory, I'll be drawing on theoretical approaches from Russian formalism of the 1920s and 30s to post-colonialism of the 1980s and 90s. But I am also interested in what these texts and how rereading these texts of the colonial era, what that can tell us about the risks of essentialism in our own era with it, what I would call an identitarian term. So I'm not distinguishing between colonial and exotic writing. This would have horrified theorists of the 1920s and 30s. It's a debate that's dealt with elsewhere by people like Thomas Mouva in particular. But what I'm discussing is fiction written in French during the period of Western imperial expansion that is set in colonized countries. And obviously I'm not discussing all of it. I'm focusing on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this period corresponds with a major expansion in modern European imperialism and the consolidation of French French colonial identity. The colonial identity is kind of missing in the earlier parts of the 19th century, even though colonialism is starting. These novels range from populist fiction to stylistic experimentation, from the obscure to the Goncourt winning, and they are indirect reflections of an early capitalist expansionist period of the world system. The legitimate question to ask is, to what extent do these plots engage with political, economic, and racial expansion? Is the world system situated as a challenge, a form of conquest, a trial, or a threat? Obviously, I can't claim to be discussing a representative selection of works, and I'm necessarily looking at a limited corpus today. But I have read a horrible number of these colonial novels because I've worked on this for many years. And I've also included a final example that shows it is possible, it was possible in that period, to challenge the narrative norms and the formal and ideological norms of the period. So I'm going to look at some tendencies that I believe are quite particular to French colonial fiction. And according to Patrick Brantlinger, who worked on British Victorian writers of colonial fiction about Africa, he claims that most of these tend towards the vaguely discredited forms of the Gothic romance and the boys' adventure story. So there are French colonial adventure stories, I wouldn't deny that. But I think one of the specificities of French colonial literature and how it narrativizes empire to popular consumption is the dominance of novels with a romance element or a false romance element and a plot that's based on those elements. So John Mohammed, again discussing British texts, talks about this as racial romance. In an allegorical narrative, as we've said, the private lives of individuals reflect imagined communities or the lives of nations. And of course, my study brings in sex, which the quote from Jameson already suggested. But I'm just remembering that Robert Young also makes an argument that sexuality is the necessary third term that links culture and race theory in the 19th century. You can't look at those two things without taking sex into account. So I think one of the most striking features of these novels, and I think what distinguishes them from a lot of British texts at the time, is the tendency towards the tragic. And there's a real downbeat attitude towards the colonial narrative. So this might seem odd and one might ask why. And I think it's for the same reason that in the fin de siècle period, the art of literature of decadence arises first in France and is only then exported elsewhere, which is why décadence in Britain is always sort of seen through a French lens. And I have a theory about this, which I put forward in the introduction to that volume on decadence and globalization and colonialism that Nikki mentioned. So my idea is that in the 19th century, what happens is that the birth rate in France is much lower than the birth rate in France's rivals, Britain or Prussia and then Germany. So that the kinds of rates of birth over replacement, population replacement that you'd expect now, or that we're not quite reaching now, of about 2 children per woman, France reaches that level a century before Prussia or Britain. So you've got the population of France's rivals that's continuing to grow dramatically, whereas French population growth is modest. And there's a great deal of anxiety, which I think is linked to this population factor. A real French anxiety about identity, and also a relative distaste for settler colonialism. And I think that's really interesting for us to read now, and I think people outside French studies should be thinking about this, because it means that there are anxieties in France in the last decades of the 19th century that are a model that foreshadow widespread anxieties in our own era, anxieties about population change and identity. So plot, things about plot. I mean, what is it? I'm not going to go into too much detail, because there's a lot of theory about this. Plot is not the same as what happens in the fictional world. You're probably familiar with Jeunette's distinction between récit and histoire. Plot is the arrangement of events in a narrative, so not just saying one thing happened and then another. But Ian Forster sees causality as an essential element in plot. So he gives a famous example. The king died and then the queen died is a story, but the king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. So causality. And then Frank Kermode, in the sense of an ending, differentiates between tick, tick, tick and tick-tock. So in tick-tock, change is introduced, and we listen for the end beat. And so these two elements, causality and change, I think are what should guide us in thinking about plot, how plot constructs causality, and how the sense of an ending changes what we've already read, that sense of anticipation of the ending. My title refers to the title of a book by Peter Brooks, who's well known to 19th, or Reading for the Plot. And Brooks, along the same lines as Kermode, emphasized the importance of the ending. The very possibility of meaning depends on the anticipated structuring force of the ending. So analysis of plot is one of the keys to understanding how fiction mobilizes narrative to help us apprehend the world we live in, or indeed, in some cases, to help us avoid apprehending the world we live in. Fiction gives us a constructed system that has its own internal logic, unlike the real world, which doesn't tend to obey tidy rules. And fiction can offer the reading public a notion of the emerging world system that is, by its very nature, outside the experience of any individual. And I think this is particularly a moment of transition at the end of the 19th century. We've got this new world system that you can't grasp, and fiction gives you a way into that, or in some cases a way of avoiding the complexity of the emerging world system. So I take inspiration loosely from Vladimir Prop's analysis of the morphology of the Russian folktale, loosely because I'm not looking at folktales and I'm not looking at a Russian corpus. But Prop gives us a way of reconciling differences between allegory and plot. So at first sight, if you're thinking about narrative in terms of plot, you'd seem to be emphasizing the syntagmatic axis, so that's the combination of events. But if you look at them in terms of allegory or theme, you'd seem to be looking at the paradigmatic axis, the axis of selection. So plot reconciles the two. He offers the way of reconciling them. So he approaches characters as plot functions. And I think that's really useful in looking at colonial narratives. So I'll be thinking about characters as function. And the analysis of folktales is interesting, but obviously it's not the same as novels. And the main dramatic difference is that in the French colonial novel, happy endings are very rare, as I've mentioned in the tragic side. So I'm going to be giving some very rapid plot summaries, and I'm worried that this might seem caricatural or reductive, but I am a reader of novels, and I don't take plot lightly. So my first example, I've subtitled it Melodrama, Europeans in Love in the Colonies. And under this heading, I'll give you the plots of two different novels by a novelist writing under the pseudonym Pierre Coeur, whose name is actually Madame Anne-Caroline Voisin-D'Ancre, and the first one has a happy ending, and the other one has a tragic ending. So, the happy ending. Georges and Félix, estranged cousins from a disunited aristocratic family, become friends as officers in the French army in Algeria. Georges falls in love with a beautiful Maurette, but she's killed by evil plotters, including her hashish-addicted husband. Georges, wounded in battle, is nursed back to health by Félix's sister-in-law, who has come to Algeria to visit him. The marriage of Georges and Laure brings together the two sides of the family. So as I said, this is an unusual example of a happy ending, and I want to contrast it with the writer's earlier novel, which was republished in the same year. This is called Les Bourgeois d'Afrique. The aristocratic Capitaine Robert, an officer in Algeria, is mysteriously obsessed by the Bourgeois tribe. He returns to France to marry and bring back with him his beautiful young cousin, Elle possédait la beauté poétique des femmes du Nord, de longs yeux bleus, ses cheveux blancs cendrés. So she's clearly embodying France. The Borgia tribe turn out to be notorious poisoners linked to the Italian Renaissance Borgia family, seeking vengeance because Captain Robert had an earlier affair with a woman of the tribe. In fact, he seduced and abandoned the young virgin. The poisoning false blonde Baya bent Borgia. The captain and his young bride are poisoned, and Baya is later killed in battle. So, Prop's analysis of the Russian folktale in terms of functions includes 7 character types. The villain, the donor, the helper, the princess and her father who functions as single agent, the dispatcher, the hero, and the false hero. And in his analysis of plot, the wedding, the final wedding, is a final reward for the hero. So it's a form of recognition by the princess's father, and the princess's hand is sort of given to the hero as a part of this material recompense for what he's done. So I'm keeping the term princess to suggest this role of final reward, but I want to add a false princess. So this is an apparent princess who is in fact the wrong woman and is a kind of sinister double to the reward function of the wedding. So this false wedding occurs earlier in the plot, and it's a moment when the hero infringes a sexual interdiction which is explicit or not explicit, and is subject to some form of trickery. So the temptation of sexual relations with the false princess becomes a kind of test or struggle, and it replaces the test that is a separate function in Cropp's fairy tales. The hero goes through a period of trial in which he has to distinguish between the false and the true princess. And in the happy version that we saw initially, the false princess dies, which enables the hero to achieve the true princess at the end. But in the tragic version, the false princess dies, but the hero has been irredeemably tainted by the encounter with the false princess, and the contamination destroys both him and his reward function, true princess. So you might be asking what all this has to do with France's colonial ideology. So I'd argue that these two plots are both means of reasserting the values of white familial identity in the threatening colonial context. They are allegories of the dangers of sexuality across racial boundaries. And Madame Voisin-Dombre also published an essay. She claims to be only the editor of it, and I'm not able to verify that. So in this essay, she does envisage the desirability of mixed marriages, but only as a hypothetical and distant possibility, and subject to the absolute requirement that the Arab partner must assimilate into the French culture. L'assimilation des indigènes est sûrement nécessaire. Il n'y a point au Maghreb place pour deux religions. L'islam est une autre quelconque qui ne serait pas l'islam. Et le problème pour le conquérant se réduit à ces alternatives, assimiler ou détruire, être assimilé ou détruit, which is quite a sinister way of putting it if you think about it. But what she's doing in her novels, the two novels that I've summarized, is giving us a melodramatic romance plot that stages this drama. Sex is a rapprochement between two peoples, and that creates an existential threat. White purity and familial values are at stake. And particularly subject to existential threat is fragile white masculinity, and that's going to pop up again and again in most of my analyses. And you have this structural opposition between the true princess and the false princess, which is mapped out not by a contrast of beauty and lack of beauty, but by a dichotomy that's based on racial markers. So the markers of true Frenchness, oddly enough, are to do with Nordic colouring, and on the other side you have relative darkness in the case of the false blonde, this dark blonde Borgia beauty. So both the false princess and the true princess are synecdoches for their races, and the hero's dalliance with one and attempts at a true union with the other are therefore racial allegory. Moving on to the 20th century, I'll be going backwards and forwards, and this is L'Atlantide by Pierre Baudouin in 1919. In a fort in southern Algeria, Capitaine de Saint-Avy tells his story to Lieutenant Ferrière. Saint-Avy, with another French explorer, Morange, was waylaid on a mission in the Sahara by Tuareg and brought to Algeria's secret kingdom in the desert, which is perhaps a legacy of the lost Atlantis that had now vanished ancient sea, ruled over by Antinea, a woman who is either a direct descendant of the god Neptune or the illegitimate daughter of a Second Empire courtesan and a disreputable Polish count. She's so beautiful that a long series of European explorers have accepted death to be her lovers. Saint-Avy kills Morange out of jealousy and escapes, but he longs for Antinea. After telling his tale to Ferrière, the latter agrees to go with him back to the human kingdom out of fascination with the mysterious Antinea to embrace their doom. So this is a tale recounted by one French officer to another in colonial Algeria about men's intrepid voyages and their suffering at the hands of a woman. And the situation of utterance reflects a really important role of homosocial relations in many of these novels, bizarrely including Madame Voisin-Dombre's novels. L'Atlantide is distinct from most colonial novels because of its use of the fantastic, and it has a relatively complex narrative structure, as you can see with the embedded tale and this analepsis. And I think it's influenced by H. Rider Haggard's fantastic African adventure tales, and in turn it inspired films, two at least under the same name, L'Atlantide, in 1921 and 1932. So Antinea becomes the model for the vamp of early cinema. So allegorically, Antinea is both African desert, mystery, and woman. And the threat posed by the mysterious Tuaregs stands in for the threat of this femme fatale figure. But it's a reversible metaphor, so racial and gender difference function as vehicle and tenor for a metaphor that works both ways. And this plot, we don't have a proprium reward princess, and there's no contrast. Antonia seems to be ambiguously both of them, either French canaille or kind of supreme exotic mystery. And it's a superb story of fragile white masculinity. And in this case, that is literally enshrined. So Antonia's victims, she has seduced a whole series of European explorers of different nationalities. And after she's had sex with them, she gets sick of them very quickly, and she has them embalmed by a mysterious process. And they're kept standing around this dining room with little neatly written labels. And you can imagine a kind of colonial collection of colonial artifacts or game, stuffed game, and that's how these men have been preserved. So it is claimed often that one of the functions of allegory is to preserve the past. But here I think there's an allegorical embodiment of a kind of process of mineralization that is so literal that it's hard to take seriously. And L'Atlantide is, in that sense, a brilliant decadent novel. It kind of does something and makes fun of itself at the same time, sort of self-parodying, which is very decadent. So I come now to a plot pattern that I've worked on a lot when I was researching métissage years ago. And I think at this point I should probably declare an interest. I would like to acknowledge my own family's wide-ranging commitment to mixing up the gene pool. I'm not the only example of that. It does seem to stretch in lots of different directions. So there are a lot of different colonial era novels and short stories that fit into this category, the tragic impossibility of the mixed race union. So I won't bore you with too many of them. The first example is a novella by Guy de Maupassant, Aluma. A French voyager meets a French colonist in Algeria and hears about the latter's on-off relationship with Aluma, a nomad who is mainly Arab with some origins from Black Sub-Saharan Africa. She lives with him family and enjoys having food, shelter, and a wardrobe with a full-length mirror. You'd be surprised how often that pops up in colonial narratives. It's kind of a status symbol. It represents what in France. But every now and then she has this burning need to return to the desert, and eventually she leaves with a Bedouin shepherd. So this is what I've called elsewhere the trope of the incomprehensible other. Aluma, in a really condensed short story form, reflects the biological essentialism of the end of the 19th century, which places enormous emphasis on racial identity. Each race has an âme, and there's no communication possible between them. Maupassant was a great womanizer himself, and he sets this incomprehensibility between races in parallel with the incomprehensibility between genders, men and women. But in a sense, what we've got is a simple short story that is an allegory for both racial and sexual incommunicability. Maupassant's story is really interesting because it sort of underlines a chasm that separates the French from the Algerian peoples. So there's a loveless and abortive sexual relationship that's an allegory for a failure of interracial assimilation. And he says this explicitly. He explicitly situates it within the context of domination by a force that cannot communicate. Jamais peut-être un peuple conquis par la force n'a su échapper aussi complètement à la domination réelle, à l'influence morale et à l'investigation acharnée mais inutile du vainqueur. And the ending of Aluma demonstrates what he sees as the impossibility of assimilation because of l'infranchissable et secrète barrière que la nature incompréhensible a verrouillée entre les races. So Maupassant's Algerian stories were influenced by his journalism. He did travel as a journalist in Algeria at a point where it had been a French colony for nearly 60 years already. And his journalism is actually very critical of France's imperialist policy. He was an anti-colonialist, but his reasons are not at all anti-racist, quite the contrary. So he writes about a kind of racist essentialism, but uses that as an argument against colonialism. Does make things slightly more complicated in thinking about it. There's still on tragic impossibility of the mixed race union. A second example is Pierre Loti's novel, Le Roman des Vieilles, set in Senegal, which is his most overtly racist work. He also represents the colonial novel in a defeatist light. So we've got a French spy, Jean, who is at first faithful to his white cousin left behind in France, and her name, Jeanne Méry, is an echo of his and suggests her proximity to his mother. He's corrupted by a mixed-race woman, Cora, and then enters into a relationship with a very young African girl. The heroines of these novels are really, really young. And called this, she's a Senegalese, and she's called Fatou. And the novel ends with Jean's death in battle, and Fatou killing their baby and then herself. So in this version, the hero encounters not one but two false princesses, and he fails his trial, with the result that he never achieves the redemptive marriage to the true princess. And the true princess is his first cousin, again, like in Madame Bazindon. that marriage would have reaffirmed identitarian and family values. But what we have instead is a progressive slide into the impurity associated with miscegenation and loss of racial integrity. It's a bit like those fairy tales where the hero has 3 different chests to choose from, but Lottie's protagonist makes the wrong choice twice, and there's no coming back from that. But his cousin arrives too late to save him. The ending is actually quite unusual for colonial era texts because a child is born. Normally mixed race couples don't have children. The very concept seems to have been troubling for this era when there were lots of learned publications in the new sciences of anthropology and in older natural history about the negative effects and possible infertility, tendential infertility, of interracial mixing. So Lottie's then stuck with this child, which is a real narrative embarrassment, and he manages to escape the narrative consequences of the birth of a mixed-race child by having it killed immediately by his black mother. A large number of colonial plots follow a pattern that's closely related to this one, which is basically white man has an affair with a very young native girl who proves to be incapable of fidelity, and there follows an unhappy end. That summarizes a large number of novels that I had the pleasure to read. So here, the failed individual relationship stands for the tragic impossibility of true union between the races. And these plots reflect the broad influence of what Pierre-André Taguieff calls mixophobic thinking, or la mixophobie, which is really important in the second half of the 19th century. So what's striking here is that these authors seem to be unable to imagine a plot ending in which colonization actually has a viable long-term future. In these racial allegories, the mixed-race relationship is sterile or ends in treachery, though could never work in the first place. And the narrative taboos of the era make it very difficult for a narrative of successful racial merging to emerge. But they don't take the other option either. So in these stories, they do not either take the option of evoking a possible viable life with separate cultural and racial communities that would coexist in the colonial sphere. So neither of those paths seem to be possible. There are some exceptions, but certainly the majority of the novels that I've read fall into this kind of idea of impossibility. Move on to another category, which is failed relationships and doomed races, and that seems to, in fact, it's a plot arc that has a lot in common with the one I was talking about, but it ramps it up an extra degree. So here, I'd say that the racial allegory takes on a new dimension, and the failed relationship is no longer an allegory just for failed integration. Instead, the destruction of one of the partners seems to be an allegory for the doom of an entire race. And the woman then stands by synecdoche again for her people. So this is an earlier novel by Pierre Loti, Le Mariage de Loti, set in Tahiti, which takes up the enlightenment myth of the Tahitian idyll, fantasy of easy sex in a hot climate, noble savage, and sexual availability and all that. It does transform it into actually what's quite a sweetly sad story of an impossible relationship, but it is another of these impossible relationships. A British lieutenant called Loti by the Tahitians has a love affair with a Polynesian girl, Rarau. When he leaves, she takes many lovers, becomes an alcoholic, and dies of tuberculosis. That's the main plot. In a subplot, during his stay, the hero searches for the Tahitian mistress of his older brother, who died when he was a child. He briefly believes that her sons are in fact his nephews, and thus represent both healing of his own childhood loss and the promise of a viable future for a Tahiti based on racial fusion. But it turns out that the dates are wrong, and the boys are not his brother's sons. So we nearly got there again. So here, I think you can see the indirect influence of secular Darwinism. Loti had definitely not read Darwin, he didn't read very much. But in this case, it's a sort of ambient pseudo-Darwinism. And Warau's death stands for the tragic destruction of weaker races. So instead of, in the Darwinian version, it's struggle within a species and between species for a niche in the ecology. But here we've got that extended to the idea of a struggle between stronger and weaker races. And the idea was that some of these peoples were just doomed. So it's a key instance of late 19th century exotic mourning, which is the idea that cultural differences are doomed, and that there's a pleasure in invoking these cultural differences, but under the sign of tragic inevitability. And racial allegory figures here as a form of figures cultural essentialism, because one of the cultures is seen as doomed to disappear. And you can only imagine that if the culture is defined in terms of a fixed identity and not something that's subject to historical change, because cultures don't disappear, they actually change rather than you see it in that way. So this is what you could call an eschatological term, as in it's a term to the doom of races. And private destiny becomes a racial allegory in which the failed couple stands synecdochically for failed assimilation and failed colonization, and the demise of the heroine stands for racial doom. And if you remember Kermode's terminology, this is the tick-tock pattern with the deeper second sound marking the sense of an ending. So I've already invoked this growing sense of mixophobie towards the end of the century. And it's a period that's marked by the influence of Comte Arthur de Gobineau's earlier Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines, published in the 1850s, but it really has more of an influence in the later decades of the century. And for Gobineau, métissage, or racial mixing, was causing the degradation of the Aryan race, and therefore of all civilization, as in his version, all civilization is originally. And novels reflecting this attitude become much more widespread, and there's a sort of scientific backing from physical anthropology. Interracial breeding, according to this often apocalyptic vision of the future, was linked to the idea of entropy, arising from popular interpretations of the new science of thermodynamics, and particularly the second law of thermodynamics, according to which disorder increases over time. And so disorder here is interpreted as lack of differentiation between people. So I'll come to my penultimate example, which is, there you are. I have the definition of thermodynamics, but not the technical one, but in a closed system, disorder increases over time. So more failed relationships, racial mixing, and civilizational decadence, so this is the entropy. And this, I'm going to talk about the winner of the Prix Goncourt of 1905, which was Claude Farrer's novel, Les Civilisés, set mostly in colonial Saigon. Three Frenchmen living mostly in colonial Saigon. Raymond Melville is a womanizing doctor, Georges Torral is a homosexual engineer and rationalist, and the hero, Comte Jacques de Gers, is a lieutenant in marine. All of them are civilisés, cynical and corrupt, indulging in multiple sexual encounters with people of various races, opium and rainbow cocktails, which is such a good image for the whole flex of mixing things up. The cocktail. We should have one later, really. The womanizing doctor falls in love simultaneously with two impossible targets. Rejected and off the range, he allows himself to be run over. Fierce falls in love with an innocent jeune fille whose surname, Silva, reflects her immunity to the corruption of the civilisé, Sylvan of the woods. And temporarily isolated from her positive influence, he returns to the civilized debauch. He rapes a Cambodian child. His fiancée then sees him with European prostitutes, so his engagement is over, and he gets himself killed heroically in an ahistorical naval battle against the English. You'll be pleased to know that the homosexual rationalist escapes. And I don't think Farrer thought of that as a good thing. So in the terms that I derived earlier from Krop, the hero's reward is the wedding to the true princess. And here again, there is a sinister double, and the result is that he loses the princess and the reward. But the sinister double is a fleeting moment in this case, a moment in a general state of civilisation, which actually means decadence. And that civilisation is equated with racial, cultural, and sexual mixing. And the tragic ending is an allegory for the decadence of French society. The abortive engagement of the hero and the promise of the reward princess look like a slim hope that true Frenchness can be saved from the decadence of modernity and mixity, and that decadence is embodied in Saigon. In true decadent fashion, society is conceived as being an imbalanced organism, and Fierce is its allegorical embodiment. And there are various false princesses in this case, but they're really not to blame. The corruption is there in the hero from the outset. It wasn't that he was innocent to begin with. My final example, you'll be pleased to know, is an exception in many ways. But we're looking at, again, cultural doom and the victory of mixing and homogeneity. But this is a colonial era novel that provides a contrast in its plot as well as in other aspects. And it is Victor Ségalen's novel set in Haiti, Les Immemoriaux from 1907. So the first part of the novel shows us the arrival of British colonizers, while the third part shows us Tahitian society 20 years later, transformed by the impact of colonial settlement and missionaries. Les Immemoriaux is most remarkable for its radical and stylistically challenging adoption of Tahitian vocalizers, which was informed by ethnographic study. But in plot terms, it also presents an interesting divergence from the patterns of the colonial and exotic novel. And I won't be talking about the style very much. If you want to read about that, read Charles's book. Very embarrassing to be speaking about this novel, but Charles is the expert on this. A novel which I think is really important and really ambitious in what it tries to do. Not sure that it entirely works, it does try something ambitious. The focalizer Terry, a trainee holy man, forgets some of the crucial oral narratives by which the Tahitian priesthood conserves the memory of the people. To avoid punishment, he joins a journey led by an older high priest, Paufai, likely to be his biological father. Paufai and Terry's lengthy voyage is to find a form of writing that would be suitable for Polynesians, to preserve and strengthen their culture that is threatened by the foreign colonizers. They reach their destination and hear an aged priest who dies shortly after speaking to them. Returning to Tahiti 20 years later, they encounter a culture that is dramatically transformed. At the end, Paufai is punished for rebellion against the new Christian regime, and Terry, now an archdeacon, does not save him. Instead, he prostitutes his daughter to foreigners in exchange for bags of iron nails, with which he will build a church, consolidating his power base as a new priest. It's a very different type of plot, as you can see, but there are some interesting parallels. So the ending of Les Immemoriaux stages the victory of mediocrity. And in this case, unlike in the previous novels that we saw, the colonial project is successful. Partly successful because the emerging new Tahiti is actually a chaotic hybrid. It doesn't really conform to the norms of Western culture or to what missions are aiming for. But it is not presented as a victory. It's the only one that has so far where colonialism works. But because Segalen adopts a Tahitian perspective and thus questions the universality of Western culture, there's an overwhelming sense of cultural loss. And in his Essays sur l'exotisme, Segalen actually borrows terms derived from thermodynamics. He talks about the mixity resulting from empire building as a form of entropy, l'entropie tiède, so this kind of lukewarm state where everything is becoming the same. So as I said, the novel is really, really striking for its stylistic innovations and its adoption of a different perspective, but go and read Charles for that. But what I want to do for today's focus on plot is tease out a few contrasts. We saw that homosocial relations were important in almost all of these novels. And that is actually also true in this novel, but the key relations are not between peers of the same age, but between a father and son or a priest and acolyte. And this father-son axis underlies the theme of failed intergenerational transmission of memory. And that's the title, Les Immemoriaux, the Forgetting Ones. So there's a mourning for lost cultural continuity, but it's situated on the side of the Tahitians, rather than focusing on the fragility of the French cultural identity. So just a few general points. These plots, I think, then give us forms of racial allegory with some recurrent patterns. And I have an overview, you can read that there. Some of the striking features, obviously not all of the features, and I've put in orange some of the more obviously divergent aspects. So as I've said, a recurrent feature, a recurrent structure in many of these novels is the opposition between a false princess and a true princess who offers a reward. The reward is framed as the reaffirmation of familial and racial identity. And this is established in racialized terms as a dichotomy often between a non-white woman and a white woman who's very closely identified with the hero's own identity, often a first cousin. There's a pattern of tests that the hero must undergo, and he often fails them. And this is one of the reasons why I'm wary of the term Manichaean that Jan Mohammed applies to colonialist racial allegory. Jan Mohammed claims that racial romances always end with the elimination of the threat posed by the other and the legitimation of the values of the good civilized society. I suspect this is just maybe not the case in French literature, it doesn't really work. And he suggests that the genre of colonial writing is an integral and necessary part of the dominant phase of colonialism. So there's a kind of anxiety about this in the case of French colonial literature. It doesn't really seem to work. Many of these novels actually enact a form of tragedy. They don't end with the assertion of triumphal values. So we've seen the tragic interracial marriage plot, the racial unity affirming marriage plot, the tragic clash of cultures plot, and the tragic mixing of cultures plot. And tragedy arises here because racial identity is constructed in terms of incompatible essences, and if you infringe those categories, then you're overstepping identitarian boundaries. These tragic endings are often prepared by the theme of white male fragility. But in Les Immemoriaux, there is also tragedy, but it's situated differently in the loss of Tahitian cultural memory. So the tragedy lies instead in the success of European colonization and the resulting destruction of a highly distinct culture. But there's still that sense of tragic loss. So it's possible that recounting tales of colonial and interracial impasse might be a specificity of French colonialism. I think they point to an underlying anxiety of empire, or what you might call a kind of pessimistic imperialism. And that's related, as I suggested, to contemporary French fears about cultural and national decadence. So there's a French stance of imperial victimhood and vulnerability, which is expressed quite differently from what Robert Young calls in his analysis of, based on British fiction, of saying that the darkest fantasy of the desiring machine of colonialism is the unlimited and ungovernable fertility of unnatural unions. So he sees that as a kind of fantasy and threat, but in the French novel, there's no fertility of unnatural unions. So no next generation. So I think the world of these novels is not Manichaean. It's not structured in terms of binary ethical judgment, with the possible exception of Pierre Coeur. But apart from Les Borges d'Afrique, none of these novels has a villain. In some cases, the false princess takes on some traits of a villain, but she's often a victim as well. The main thrust of the plot is the failure of the hero to pass a test of identitarian integrity. And that is even true of Les Immemoriaux, although in a very different way. So the endings of these novels expose the French colonial ideal of assimilation as a hollow sham, but not for the reasons that one might put forward today. Allegorical writing has been seen as inherently committed to reworking versions of history, but I'm also interested in how allegory works to think about futurity, or rather the future as it's envisaged in the past. And the future that is envisaged in these allegorical plots is extremely bleak. The colonial mission, whether you see it as civilisatrice or as supporting the glory of France, fails. The union of diverse peoples fails. Mixity leads to civilizational decline in some cases, in an eschatological nightmare. And racial allegory does not lead to the interpretative clarity of a master code in the service of a dominant power system, which is sometimes the claim made of allegory. Some of the texts, on the contrary, seem to offer allegories of the incomprehensible other. So they don't legitimize power relations. They sort of enact the failure of power relations. So I'm not arguing that these texts are anti-colonialism, though Maupassant, Loti, and Segalen were anti-colonial in different ways and to differing degrees. Racial allegory reveals a colonial anxiety that undermines the logic of colonialism. And with the exception of Les Immemoriaux, these colonial era fictions reflect an inability to think the new world system. And I think that their thinking in terms of fixed categories also shows us how this identitarian thinking risks a form of essentialism that can lead to conceptual dead ends. And that is where I think they might still have lessons to give us today. Thank you.
A particularly warm welcome to Alison Britton, Celia's sister, to Luciana Britton-Newell, her niece, to her long-standing friend, Pamela Church-Gibson, and to Stella Bruzzi, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities in UCL, who has generously sponsored our wine reception. Jane Gilbert would have been here as well, but unfortunately can't. Stella would like to say a few words, I think, before we kick off.
Yes, just I don't want to hold people up. I'm so pleased that we were able to host this event, and definitely, UCL. And I mean, I am a complete interloper here. I'm a film studies person, not a French studies person. So James is here representing UCL, but we very much. I mean, she was so important to the Department of French and what is now the School of European Languages, Culture and Society at UCL, that we wanted so much to remember Celia and to mark how important she was to Francophone studies. So I'm delighted that we were able to put this together.
Thank you. Thanks, Stella. I'm going to kick off as chair, and then we're going to go in the order, I think, that people are named in the programme, which slightly maps onto the order in which they knew Celia. And I'm going to be very brutal on timing as well. I think we said 5 minutes each, is that right? And at the end, if there's time for a few kind of comments or reminiscences, that's all to the good. I've always thought of Celia Britton as the Fiona Shaw of our field. Partly, and I can see it's resonating already, partly to do with her height, her elegance, and her wonderful speaking voice, which I know is a pleonasm, but also because of her towering presence, her no-nonsense style, and at times intimidating manner, but a kindness and a real sense of mischief, kindness, and fairness. I met her first when I served as postgraduate representative for the Society of French Studies, and I immediately irked her. At the time, I was compiling a register of current research being done by postgraduate students in French studies. She was president of SFPS. At the time, even in 1996, we could see a tremendous growth in the so-called Francophone studies part of the postgraduate research world. I'd been advised by a well-meaning colleague that in compiling this compendium, this kind of encyclopedia of what every postgrad student in the country, in Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales were working on, I should avoid dead wood and therefore should cut off at 5 years of enrolment on a research degree. I proudly turned up at the first committee meeting in Magdalen College, a very intimidating space, I have to say, and announced that I was drawing the line at 5 years enrolment, never thinking that I myself would go into a 5th year. This was my first. And Celia was horrified and quite rightly objected on the basis that this was very, very unfair to part-time students who inevitably would take longer to work their way through the PhD. To me, it gave a sense, I think, of her fairness, of her attentiveness to people who were facing particular challenges, and to her sense, I think, that this should be an inclusive and an equal register in which everybody was visible, everybody was present. I think she herself was supervising in Aberdeen some part-time PhD students. I was still on this committee in 1997, for the 50th anniversary of the Society of French Studies, to which she made such a strong contribution, when one of the keynotes that were invited by Celia was Julia Kristeva. This spoke, I think, to her generational training, as much as to an ambition for the Society to reach out to the major names in the French Academy. Kristeva at the time was one of the most emblematic figures of that French intellectual elite. As Celia herself reflected in a 2014 essay, unlike most of the current generation of researchers in Francophone studies, I came to the field having worked for 20 years in linguistics, avant-garde French literature, the nouveau roman in particular, structuralism, and post-structuralist literary and film theory. This training is manifest in her Edouard Glissant book, itself 25 years old this year, and that's another anniversary that we might like to reflect upon, and whose importance, I think, can't be underestimated in the move of Glissant into the Anglo-American, whatever you want to call it, academy. As I think Sam Hay said in a review of the book, the title in some ways is unduly modest. It doesn't really do justice to the ambition of what the book is about, because it's at once a searching theoretical elaboration and the first to embed Glissant's fiction with a close textual analysis, a rigour of very, very close reading, which opens Glissant's novels as well as his theory up for an Anglophone readership. And Francophones had much to learn as well. Celia and I would see each other regularly at conferences and other events over almost 30 years. She was my PhD external, along with Mary Gallagher, ici présente, a referee for me on many, many really important things, but perhaps the most important, my lectureship back in 2000 in Queen's, when she really didn't know me that well, but somehow having Celia in your corner made a difference. She wrote the blurb for my most recent book, but especially memorable was a visit to Martinique in 2017, when we went together to Edouard Glissant's grave. I thought I had a photograph of this that I could show, but as it turns out, it was her camera that the photographs were taken on, and as we know, she was a very avid photographer. And then just this year, Charles Forestick and I, and what we couldn't have imagined would be our last encounter with her, had dinner with her in Hull just a couple of weeks before her death. I would like also to say that one of the most striking tributes I can pay to Celia is that in death she requested that donations be made to medical aid for Palestinians, and I think that too speaks volumes to her integrity, her passion, and her commitment to justice in a global sense. Thank you. I'm coming over to... It's you, Mary. Thank you. It's you.
I'm just timing myself because I'm afraid I won't fit everything in. I just want to make sure I get to say the most important things. So First of all, thanks very much for organising this session today. I think it's awfully important that we get a chance to speak about Celia. I would like to speak from memory, but also from the heart about what Celia meant to me. What I'd like to trace here is the role that she played in the ecosystem of support that surrounds an academic life. Not an academic career, mind you, an academic life. Celia mattered very much to me in my trajectory through an academic life. If that's a significant fact, it's because her role in my academic career was negligible for reasons that I might get to explain later. I don't think I will. Anyway, that's a fact. If that's a significant fact that she mattered to me very much in my trajectory through an academic life, it's because we're talking about Celia having mattered enormously to a person whose world, whose academic world, only intersected very glancingly with hers. Because I studied in the French system as a postgraduate, and then I worked exclusively in Ireland throughout my academic life. So her role in my academic life was major. I can't remember the first time I met her. I suspect it was after I began to work on Edouard Glissant, which was precisely 2 years after Glissant chaired my doctoral viva in Paris. I first presented a paper on his work in 1990 at a conference in Oporto in Portugal, which was organised by French colleagues and was later then published in France. Celia may or may not have been there. I don't remember. That would have been long before I began to feel her supportiveness, however, long before I began to think of her as an ally, long before I began to know that she would champion me in any application that I might have made. It was certainly not before I applied in 1991 to move from Maynooth University to what has been known for 20 years now as Ireland's Global University, aka University College Dublin, competition for Trinity College Dublin. Maybe I first really got to know Celia just around about 1993, 1994. I would imagine it was that. But the fact that I can't remember when I first got to know Celia shows that I cannot remember a time when I didn't know her in my academic life. I certainly know that I already knew her sometime before she encouraged me to speak at the 100 Years of French Studies 1997 conference that Maeve has, I think, maybe already referred to. It was in the Sorbonne. She was president of the Society of French Studies, and she organised this jamboree conference in the Sorbonne. And I have a very clear memory of Celia standing there with a cigarette in her hand, looking so calm. I couldn't understand it. I also know that I invited her to Dublin in 1999 to the Conference on French Caribbean Studies that I organised there on the main campus of UCD in the southeast suburbs of Dublin. She came to Dublin therefore in early September of that year with her husband Lyle, and she asked me to recommend a hotel that would be central for Lyle, somewhere where he could explore, downtown Dublin for him. I recommended Bloom's Hotel in the Temple Bar area of Dublin, which is the place where pen parties and stag nights were. At the time, that's what it was. And I gathered from Celia when I inquired on the morning of that the conference opened, if they were happy with the hotel, that neither she nor Lyle had closed an eye the previous night. Celia and I met again at Maeve's Viva in Queen's University, Belfast. That was in late 2000. There were other academic professional encounters. The strangest of these was at a conference, a very small, select conference, I suppose, in 2008 on the American tropics. It took place in Essex University in a sort of private residential campus club. That night, Celia disappeared. And the next morning, I remember being, checking up on her, and I think she thought I was a very strange person to be worried about her. She had been off with a friend. I have a solar memory, like Maeve, of her at a combat conference where she visited Glissant's grave in Martinique in 2017. So a lot of these memories are crisscrossed with Maeve's, with friendship with Maeve. The three of us gave papers at that conference in French in Martinique. And I'll say what I remember most about that encounter with Celia at the very end. The last time that we intersected was at a conference in Paris in 2018. It was a conference on Glissant. It was organised by Glissant's son-in-law, who had just written a very controversial biography of Edouard Glissant. It's a very tense conference. It was boudé by, of course, Glissant's widow, Sylvie, and by his son, Mathieu. But it was attended by Celia, it was attended by Michael Dash, and it was attended by myself. We all gave papers in French again. I'm so glad that we sought out a cafe after sort of last session in the 5e arrondissement, Michael, Celia, and I. Michael was very unwell at the time, and I never saw either of them alive again. So I just finish up with 3 very small notes. One is that, for me, the most precious thing that Celia wrote was that book on community. I keep going back to it. Because it's about community. Because it's about le vivre ensemble. The other thing I just want to say is that I don't know if it was the first or the second time I met Celia, but I have this memory of the two of us in a washroom, bathroom of some university. And she said something to me, of course in confidence, about her head. She had had a head scare. And that was important to me. And that conversation that I'd come back to in Martinique in 2017 was about her Irishness. She had just become an Irish citizen, and she told us the story, myself and May, the story of her Irishness. And that was just incredibly momentous for me, because Celia was, of course, intellectually, everything that Maeve said is so true, was so true for me. She was just this person who, if she was in your corner, she was really in your corner. Especially when you were au point, especially when you were in a corner. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, Maeve has already got there, was I was so moved when she, even from the other side of that curtain, expressed her solidarity with the hunted and the butchered. So I see, can't say any more.
I think we moved to Michael Saratinsky. I didn't introduce Mary Gallagher, but I think she doesn't need much introduction here, from the Global University. Michael Saratinsky worked for many years with Celia in the University of Aberdeen. Can you hear us, Michael?
How fast? Is that the sound?
Yeah, that's great. Fire away, Michael.
You really? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, so, hi everyone from afar. I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you in person, so I could catch up with so many friends there at what looks like it was a terrific conference, and I'm sure Celia would have enjoyed it immensely. So, as you sort of mentioned, yeah, I worked for a long time with Celia, and I consider it one of the really greatest privileges of my professional life to have counted Celia as a dear friend, and to have worked alongside her so closely at Aberdeen, and to have had the opportunity to collaborate with her on so many events, publications, and other projects. I won't repeat what I've already said in the context of a Society for French Studies tribute, but I would like to talk for a few minutes about Celia as, and it sort of cuts across what you've already said, and Mary, someone who cared as a carer in the fullest sense of the term, someone who was deeply caring and emotionally engaged in everything she did. There was a fearless quality about Celia that no doubt came from being a champion diver and open sea swimmer, and a core of steely determination, which in some ways was perhaps necessary for a woman to succeed as well as she did in what was still at the time, you know, fairly male-dominated upper echelons of academia. Now, some, I think, mistook this for coldness and aloofness and found that side of her a bit intimidating, but nothing could be further from the truth about Celia once you got to know her. And I think her intellectual brilliance really was allied to that a kind of deep emotional intelligence, as well as a wickedly funny wit and sense of humor. She was also, let us not forget, an unwaveringly dedicated carer for Lyle for most of the latter half of her life. And in relation to what it means to care, so to care for and to care about, we have many, over the years, many long, memorable conversations about psychoanalysis, particularly about the great psychotherapist and pioneer of early child development and attachment theory, Donald Winnicott, who also happened to be Celia's uncle. And I remember when she first told me this, her first mention of Uncle Donald. Donald Winnicott was your uncle? Big surprise, face emoji. So while in Aberdeen, she was also immensely caring towards our children, in particular our adopted son, who came to us at age 4, and she understood better than really most people, I think, the effects of childhood trauma and neglect. And I'm sure that her uncle's work helped her develop her own interest in psychoanalysis. And she'd often tell me that I should write about attachment theory and literature, which I've always intended to, and which I am now determined to in a manner of a kind of urgent promise, which I owe it to Celia to keep. So that's now on the burner. That link between caring for another and caring about others, I think, is perhaps how we can best understand the intimate relationship for her between psychoanalysis, the therapeutic dimension of psychoanalysis, and the broader political or socio-political perspective, including her own political principles, and which, to my mind, produced some of her most important and original insights into the sort of complex intertwining of psychoanalysis and politics. That focus has been apparent really throughout her work, from the early books on the nouveau roman to her interest in cinema and film theory, Jacqueline Rose, Christian Metz, Stephen Heath, and so on, through to Fanon, of course, and the Franco-Caribbean more widely. And in my opinion, it's her race and the unconscious Freudianism in French Caribbean thought that we find her furthest reaching insights in this regard, especially that chapter on a brilliant chapter on psychoanalysis and social disorder. So it's about sort of what happens most importantly when things break down, both psychically and socially. And Fanon is the pivotal reference here, of course, but it takes a deep into more Manley's work and also what is at stake in using Freud and Lacan to talk about racial identity and racial difference, and its compatibility or not through a Caribbean context, particularly in terms of family and community. And this then leads her subsequently to some of the most original applications I know of Jean-Louis Nancy's term community, at least as he theorizes it, and I would completely agree with Mary on that score there. And of course, I think it's no accident that the university was the place, whether Aberdeen or UCL, the pedagogical community where those elements of caring for and caring about would find their natural home. And it was here, I think, that her kind of incomparable rigor and lucidity and directness that we find in her work and her writing, it would be no less a constant and defining feature of her teaching and her commitment to her students, but also to the profession more generally as a colleague and as one of our finest, I think, and most inspiring of leaders. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful. I'm passing on to Martin Monroe, Professor Martin Monroe from Florida State University, and an ex-PhD student of CS.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here, for remembering Celia with us. I think we're all, those of us who knew Celia, either personally, professionally, or your works, we're all very fortunate. But I think Kate and I are especially fortunate because we were students. And in my case, I was Celia's student from the first year of my undergraduate degree right to the end of my PhD. So yeah, I think I'm particularly privileged and fortunate. And so I'm actually going to talk a little bit about Celia as a teacher, because that's how I knew her principally, and that's largely how I remember her. So yeah, I think my first encounter with Celia was in my first year at Aberdeen, which was 1992, 93. And as everyone says about Celia, she was a presence, if you're a first year student. I was actually a mature student. I went to university a few years later than most people. And so yeah, Celia was there. I think she had recently arrived, as had Michael. So there was I felt, a real energy about the place and a real forward-looking impetus. And that was largely down to Celia's leadership and Michael as well. So yeah, I think my first encounter with Celia in class was when she taught a fairly little-known work by an author called Joseph Zobel. It was A la mer n'est pas bleue. I don't know if many people will have read this text, but it's a fairly thin volume. It's short stories, basically, by Zobel, who was a Martinican author. So I was very excited to read this, because I liked all the metropolitan French stuff, but I was particularly drawn to the Caribbean work always. So yeah, I think I had read the text itself, and that these were short stories, and they were about childhood and what seemed to me rather kind of simple observations about life. But what struck me about Celia was in her lectures the way that she brought out the complexity of the work, even in what might appear relatively simple, straightforward text. She was a brilliant close reader. However brilliant she was as a theorist, she was, as a close reader, as someone who always paid close attention to the text, she was really incredible and inspiring in that sense. And I think, my own work, my own modest way, I think I tried to stay faithful to those principles. So yeah, I was really impressed by what she did, and I think some people talk about how well she prepared for class. She took that really seriously, however brilliant she was as a researcher, that, the lectures were so precise, the handouts, she would have these family trees of if she was teaching Glisson or something, she would just go into so much detail, and there was always an element of close reading in her classes. So yeah, I mean, she would come in and she would, be very imposing, and as everyone has said, but once she got down to the work, it was like you were her equal, and she wanted you to feel the way that she did about the text, and it was a real talent, I think. So after that, I think my next encounter, at least in terms of literature, was when she taught Alain Robbe-Crier's Les Gommes. Of course, that was her other original field of expertise, the nouveau roman. And again, with that very different kind of work, but still, a real talent for helping you through a difficult, complex work and showing you how to think about that kind of text, to write about it. So, and then maybe the biggest turning point for me, at least in terms of my academic life, was a final year course that Michael and Celia devised, which was it was Francophone literature, I think it was called, and this was the new thing, and it was a really exciting development, I think, and Celia and Michael put in so much work to it. Michael taught the African side of it, but I think there were 3 Caribbean novels, Jacques Rouban, Gouverneur d'Arrosé, Edouard Glisson, Le 4e siècle, Simon Schwarzbach, Louis Lebon sur Dénommé Miracle. And I think in this course, Celia was really in her element. This is her new passion. She was writing about Glisson, and she was full of that feeling of having discovered something that really meant something to her, and equipped with all the tools that she had from her working on the Nouveau Roman, she really brought a kind of rigor, and not just a rigor, but I think a real feel for her work. People talk about Celia's politics, and it's so touching that her final tribute and so on. But and I was asked about this when Celia was, shortly after Celia's death. Would you say Celia was political? She never said, I'm political on this and that, but I thought it was very personal, the way that she would treat students. And then, like I say, she always treated me as an equal, and, never made you feel, anything other than that. So that for me was okay, that's what you do, what you say, that's your politics. And I think that was very much the case with Celia. So yeah, that course was a real, turning point for me. And I was in my 4th year at Aberdeen, final year, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. So just one fateful day, I think I was walking past Celia's office, and her door happened to be open. She was summoned me in, and I thought, oh gosh, what's going on here? So, well, come in, Martin, I want to have a word with you, kind of thing. I said, okay. She said, well, what she basically said was, yes, Martin, I wondered if you'd ever considered staying on to do a PhD. Oh gosh, I'd never thought of that. And she didn't force me into it, but she said very encouraging things. Yeah. No, but she said, oh yes, I think you could write a very good thesis. And I thought, oh gosh, I'd never even considered it, really. So, yeah, and then I told the story before when Celia's retirement. We had an event here in London in 2011 or so. Yeah, so this was the same meeting, and Celia had asked me to if I would think about doing a PhD. She said, yeah, I think you would do a good thesis, Martin. And she nodded her eyes. She had very striking eyes, and she looked at me and said, yes, you are the type. So I always remember that because I didn't think I was the type. So if I ever doubt myself, I remember what Celia said. Okay, right, I must be the type. So after that, I did the PhD, and we had a brilliant relationship together. We meet regularly. Of course, she'd be smoking at her office. Do you mind if I smoke, Martin? No problem. So but she was really just, as everyone has said, she just became a really attentive, supportive mentor. Someone who always had your back, as they say, and who was, just even at a distance, you always felt she was there, so, yeah. Another thing about Cecilia, just very quickly, she's very forward-looking, as an academic, as a person. And if she was at a conference like this, she'd be hanging about with the younger crowd. You know, she'd want to talk to them about their work, and she'd be very much like that. That I was, I appreciate that about her as well. So that this coldness that people talk about, it's a kind of a myth, I think. So yeah. Anyway, time passed, and I got my PhD. I moved to Ireland, and I moved to Trinidad, and I've been in Florida for a while. And Celia always kept in touch. She's not, now and then, but every year she'd send me a Christmas card. And we would exchange cards, which was just lovely, really. So just finally, what I remember one email she sent to me. I don't know what the occasion was, but it's a very short email. It's all very short, So I don't know why she said it, but something like, I don't think I tell you very, very often, Martin, but I'm very proud of you.
She told everyone else.
Oh, did she? So I do remember that for her having said it once. And finally, I would like to say, Celia, I have been, and I always will be proud to have been your student. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We're passing over to Professor Charles Forrester, University of Cambridge.
Lovely, thank you, May, and many thanks to the Society for giving us time this afternoon to remember Celia. Serendipitously, I've ended up as a fellow in the college where Celia was an undergraduate student. Murray Edwards now, new, thank you Pamela, new hall then, and it was always new hall for Celia. And she made sure I knew that. But Celia was there at the beginning of my academic career as well, because when she was the very august Carnegie professor in Aberdeen, a couple of years later I arrived in Scotland as a junior professor in Glasgow, and with Michael and with Martin and with Celia, we set up a group called the Scottish Forum for Francophone Studies. Celia was very supportive of that, and I learned from that early stage that she was this great champion of, Martin's mentioned it, of early career researchers, and fiercely loyal always to those with whom she worked closely. The other thing that was important for me when I arrived in Glasgow, as the junior lecturer there, I ended up teaching on the illegal because nobody else wanted to teach it. And what did I do? I turned to Celia's work on Google, lucid, sort of unpacking these difficult texts, and I remember they were a real lifeline. And what I've appreciated when people have been talking about Celia's work is that reminder that for 20 years she worked on legal law. She worked. It wasn't just the Caribbean focus. Maybe you mentioned it. So on experimental fiction, she wrote a magnificent book on Claude Simon. When he was Road to the Unknown, before he won the Nobel Prize, and I couldn't agree more with what was said about that transition. There was a continuity there. So the work on experimental fiction led very much, I think, to Celia's work on the Caribbean, not least through texts like La Lézard by Brisson in the 50s, which was very much a Caribbean new novel. And just to think about that move in Celia's work to the Francophone Caribbean, because of the context we're in the society, but also the Association for the Study of Caribbean and African Literature in French, which was our predecessor. Just wanted to remember also Celia's work with Bridget Jones, who was one of the founders of our association in Reading. And what I can imagine were really important conversations between the two of them as Celia decided on this new direction in her work. We've heard it already. She was a brilliant, close reader, but also somebody who effortlessly handled complex theory in complementing that close reading. We owe her so much in terms of bringing the work in our subject area into the mainstream. When she was an outstanding president of Society for French Studies, that was really the beginning of that association. which at the time was rather conservative and very much focused on France and French literature and the canonical, opening up that society's way and our field more broadly to the Francophone Caribbean. Maeve's mentioned Celia's book on the 1999 book on Edouard Bisson. It's something I keep coming back to. It hasn't aged at all. Not least because she was already talking about those questions of language and translation in Bisson, which are now much more to the fore. It was a real privilege to publish 2 of her books in my series at the Liverpool University Press. One Mary mentioned, the sense of community in French Caribbean fiction, and then also language and literary form in French Caribbean writing, and then much you understand from Celia through that editorial process. In her final years, in the context of the British Academy, we worked together very briefly, unfortunately, but Celia was a brilliant chair of the section there, modern languages section, a major presence at the Academy. But the final thing I wanted to mention was the way in which, over the past 4 or 5 years, Celia had this final career as a translator. She said to a number of us, that's the last article I'm publishing. I think I've said what I want to say. But then, through the collaboration with Alexandre Lupin, Louisiana State University of Baton Rouge, Celia translated 3 of Nisson's texts. Le Traité du Monde, Introduction au Vieilles, and Rwanda. She was a cautious, erudite translator. Those translations are really rooted in her intimate knowledge, not just of Nisson's work, but also in the context of that work. She could on occasion be stubborn when we were having conversations about translation of a particular word. But the work that emerged was brilliant. Chloé Ramontin, she completed 6 months or so before her death, so I'm currently getting that ready for publication. And it's nice to think that when that book is published, it will be a posthumous act, I think, of generosity on Celia's part, to share, to make sure this work, this important work, is shared with English language readers.
Thank you. Passing over to James Agar, who I think acts as a bridge between Aberdeen and London, is currently in UCL. So James, over to you.
Thanks very much. I first met Celia 28 years ago in this building in a lift, and we were the only 2 people in the lift. It went 4 floors, and the journey felt as though it was about 37 minutes. I plucked up the courage eventually to say how much I'd enjoyed the paper I'd heard give on Bisson, and she did the narrowing of the eyes, and what felt like looked down on me from on high, and said, "Thank you, and who are you?" And 2 years later, I think it was about 2 years later, she'd clearly forgotten who I was. She did me the utmost generosity of giving me a job at Aberdeen, where I stayed for 2 years, and where she ran a very tight ship and was a very stern boss. And then, having left Aberdeen myself, Celia subsequently left, and then a year later joined us at UCL, where she stayed for 8 years on a 20% contract. But she absolutely engaged with us at UCL much more than the niceties of a contract would have demanded. She had PhD students, she refashioned and remodeled our MA offering, she offered and introduced a final year module on French Caribbean fiction that was very popular. She taught first year backup seminars, as it were, on the big introductory course for first year students. So she mucked in every sense at all levels of departmental life, and she was absolutely great in departmental meetings because she could cut through the crap, if you'll pardon the expression, and just say as it was. And at times I think we benefited from that, and maybe occasionally needed it. But I wanted really to share a moment of levity in relation to Celia. And in addition to the authority of her voice, what I wanted to remember today was her laugh. a laugh which could be tinged on the outer edges with a slight sort of mischievousness, and even occasionally with a sort of wonderful wickedness. And one anecdote which I'll share, she came to see me in my office telling me that the following term she was on research leave. And having been in academia for 30 odd years, during this research leave she was going to take a holiday. So she was going to go to Lanzarote, and she knew that I'd been, so she asked me for some insight, shall we say, about Lanzarote. So I said about the Mirador, and I said about the caves, and I said about Timanfaya volcano and the Cesar Manrique Foundation. She sort of looked and listened intently, looking thoroughly bored. And then at the end of it said, I want to know about restaurants and bars. So I gave her the benefit of some of my not inconsiderable experience on both of those counts. You don't get anybody like this by not eating or drinking. And she then said to me, she said, actually, I'm really looking forward to it, because both Lyle and I are going. And she said, actually, we booked it, you know. She sort of looked around to check that there was nobody hiding under the table. We booked it through Saga. So I said, oh, well, you know, that's great. She said, it's a little bit strange that you imagine yourself getting to an age where you can book with Saga. So I absolutely kept my face straight, because I thought, you've been at that age for some time yet. So anyway, our conversations ended, and she went up to leave and sort of half opened the door. And I thought, shall I? Yeah, go on, I'll chance my arm. So I said, oh, Celia, have a really good holiday if I don't see you before. But promise me this, that Lyle and yourself will not turn into Saga Louds. She laughed with a sort of a mischievousness, shut the door and turned round, and the eyes narrowed again. And still laughing, she put up a finger and she said to me, James, I haven't told anybody that I have booked this holiday with Saga. And if anybody finds out, I will know exactly where it has come from. And then she laughed, with not mischievousness, but with absolute authoritative looking, and left the room. And to this day, I haven't said that. But now on film and in front of her family, my apologies, Celia, I share it. But I share it because of the warmth of her laugh. And beyond all of the brilliance as a teacher, as a manager, as a leader, as a shaper of the discipline, as an advocate for younger colleagues, she was also a real person, warm company, and somebody who really liked to laugh.
Thank you, James. We're handing over now to Kate, who, like Martin, has been taught by Celia, who is in University College Cork.
Well, how to follow that. So 2024 was the year of passing of Celia and Maurice Conde. I consider myself fortunate enough to have been in the practice of both of them at the same time. Celia very typically, generously called me over when I was a PhD student at the conference, introduced me to my school. I don't remember what we said at all because I was completely overawed and very impressed that Celia, my supervisor, knew the famous Nice Bundy, who is one of my favourite writers working on French, so a very memorable woman, and one of many for which I can thank Celia, who is a wonderful supervisor and advocate for grad students and early career people in the best possible way. I can thank Celia also for her model training in close reading, as everyone has said, her grounded and subtle approach to literature. Celia was so generous with her time and her scholarship, especially after her retirement, and came over to Cork just after I moved there and gave a wonderful paper on Conde's Creole, which she also published an essay on in her book in 2018, The Perspectives on Culture and Politics, which is the book that showcased the breadth and depth of her expertise from Lisson to René Benny to Jean Nancy to Faulkner to Conde, and always the Francophone Caribbean's rich and diverse literary scene. And as well as the Antillean authors that Celia wrote about, Lisson foremost amongst them, she did have a few Haitian authors in her sphere of interest as well. In her later books, she wrote on both de Hestre and Jacques Roumain, and I remember she taught de Hestre at UCL as well when we sent her literary in her class. And we talked about those authors a lot in our supervisions, as well as about Haitian collective memory and politics of Haiti's post-dictatorship situation. So I was very lucky to have had Celia as a supervisor. I ended up with Celia as a supervisor by accident. I moved to UCL and I got Celia, so it was incredibly fortunate for me, and she was an amazing supervisor. She was erudite, she was precise, she was so patient with students, it was so funny. There was a few Monty Python jokes that cropped up in supervisions from time to time as well. And I said at the start that Celia's generosity, her constant, unstinting generosity, is the thing that I associate most with her. She was generous with her intellectual community, her books, her time, her wit. and her contribution was marked, as Charles said, on her retirement in 2011 with a conference and a special edition of Paragraph, to which a number of us here contributed. I graduated in 2010 and Celia retired the following year, so I think I maybe was her last supervisee, or certainly one of her last supervisees. She did go on to publish and do a lot of work for the British Academy in the years that followed. I'm so pleased to have had this opportunity to speak about the formative influence of Celia's work and her intellectual input, her patience and her encouragement and her advocacy as a supervisor. Thank you to May for organising this session and fitting it into this very packed and wonderful programme. Thank you.